This study is on the book of Numbers, and like the one on Leviticus, it will focus on overarching principles rather than the little minute details, which we can find in Constable's notes at the link in the description, and I'm going to be showing that here because the order of events in the Greek and Hebrew text is significantly different and would be difficult to follow and confusing, so we'll just go with the standard order, and I'll probably keep doing more of the Old Testament lessons this way unless we have a really serious difference in meaning between the two texts. But key events in Numbers are going to include the spineless treachery of Balaam and the defeat of Jericho. Actually, we don't really get to the details of Jericho here, but they do come right up to the gate, so we're getting, that's how far Numbers covers. But the main point is that Israel's wandering was the direct result of their unfaithfulness to God. Now, as shown in the outline here on page 4 of Constable's notes, the first 25 chapters center on the older generation and its eventual disqualification for entering the Promised Land, and chapters 26 to 36 turn to the younger generation after them. And notice how the Bible is defining generation here. It should not be confused with lifespan. A generation is defined by parents and children because the parents are one generation, the children are the next. And there's no set length of time. It's usually from when one group of people is old enough to marry and have children, and that's when the next generation will start. So the wandering of Israel, if you count, mostly they were camped, but the total time from leaving Egypt to entering the Promised Land was 40 years. But a lot of that 40 years was just waiting for a generation to die, not because a generation is defined by the Bible as 40 years. That's just the length of time it took from the time of their major rebellion to the time all of those rebels died off and their children grew up and took over. That took 40 years. That is not how long a generation is. Okay, generation could be anywhere from 20 on up, because that's the age at which typically, at least in the Bible, Israelites were considered adults and able to fight in the army at the age of 20. So we could conceivably, pun intended, use 20 as a generation. But again, there's going to be decades of difference in ages of one generation. So because children could be born when the parents are 20, 30, 40. So it's just a group of people born to a certain set of parents, to a certain group of parents. So in the study, just as a quick side note about generations, the study of Bible prophecy, a lot of people err in taking Jesus' statement, "This generation shall not pass away," as meaning 40 years after Israel is reestablished in the land, or latest case, after Jerusalem is retaken, which was 1967 for that, and 48, of course, for their establishment from the Balfour Declaration. But at best, Jesus meant that the generation of adults at that time that sees that rebirth would see the completion of all the prophecies. If that's the case, the outside limit would be about 60 years after 1967, if the people who were 20 years old lived to be 80, which would bring us to 2027 as far as the outside limit of when the tribulation would be over, because that's the signs that Jesus talked about. So if we take it as a generation of adults at the time that Jerusalem was taken in 67, if they were 20 years old and they lived to be 80, from 67, that would take us to 2027. That's, just a quick calculation, but the point is that a generation is not 40 years. A generation is not 100 years. Those are lifespans and times of judgment and so forth. 40 is a very common and significant number in scriptures, but it does not define generation as 40 years. That's the point. But whether we're studying the past or the future, God will never break his promises, and that includes the perpetuation of Israel as a nation. If you want to look that up, Jeremiah 31, 35 to 37. That's where it says that that nation, Israel, will endure as long as the earth and sky endure, no matter how far the people stray. So this is a lesson for replacement theologists and fulfillment theologists. They should read Jeremiah 31, 35 to 37, because that's where it says point blank, this nation of people is never disappearing as long as the earth remains. Now, the earth will not remain forever. It will be replaced. Revelation, the later chapters, 20 and so forth, that then maybe you could say there won't be a nation of Israel in eternity, but there certainly will be one through the millennium. And that's the point. So now let's go down to Constable's notes on page 11 there, to the first census, and it was to determine the amount of land needed for each of the 12 tribes, along with the size of the army to clean out the promised land. In those early chapters, we also see that the tribes camped around the tabernacle evenly, 3 on a side, though the Levites camped on all 4 sides closest to it. So there's the arrangement by directions, with the tabernacle in the middle, and you can see the Levites are on the inside with different clans on each side, and that we have Manasseh and Ephraim over here, so it comes out to the 12. Otherwise you'd be going, well, that's only 11. If there's a 12 on the inside, that's only 11. But Joseph's tribe is split into his children, Manasseh and Ephraim. So that's how that works out. But the priests were guarding the holy place, basically. And that's because also that the Levites have no land, so there's some significance with that. But of particular interest here is also that the animals representing 4 of the tribes, Revelation 4:7 lists 4 creatures, and they're described as a lion, a calf or ox, a human, and an eagle, which also match the 4 angelic beings of Ezekiel 1:10. So we can see here that, according to this quote, or from rabbinical tradition at least, the standard of Judah bore the figure of a lion, Reuben was the man, Ephraim the ox or calf, and Dan the eagle. So there's a lot of those 4 creatures through the Bible, just as there are the 2 witnesses in both testaments and so forth. These things repeat in cycles, more like a spiral, not repeating exactly the same thing, but moving along in a spiral is how you could visualize Bible prophecy and symbolism. Now, there's also a thing in Ezekiel 45, 48 through 48 called the City of the Lord, or the Lord is there. And this is distinct from the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21. But what I'm talking about with all of these things is the 12 tribes. The name of these 12 tribes, if we go back up to this little illustration, keep repeating as well. They are not always in the same order or the same position, but we know that the New Jerusalem will have 3 gates on a side, for each named after one of the 12 tribes, just as the foundation will have the names of the 12 apostles. The Lord is there, or the City of the Lord in Ezekiel 45 through 48 will also have those on the holy city. So this is a big deal to God. This is a symbolism that we're being told about. These names of these tribes, we have to remember, not only have prophetic symbolic meaning, but they are still named after genetic lines. And so, as I mentioned about the fact that they would endure as a nation until heaven and earth passed away, all of this stuff together mitigates against the teaching that since Jesus came, God has dispensed with any physical nation of chosen people. That just simply isn't biblical. Now let's go down to page 18. And it says, this is where we get into what we call the jealousy test of chapter 5 in Numbers. And we remember also in our study of Exodus when Moses threw soot into the air and it caused boils to break out on the Egyptian skin. Well, this test has to do with dust as well. And in this case, if a wife was suspected of adultery, she was brought to the temple court, and they would have a little ceremony or something and put some dirt from the floor of the temple into a cup of water and make her drink it. And what this would actually do is, first of all, discourage false accusations of adultery by jealous husbands who are just suspicious. Since if she drank this stuff and nothing happened, she would be proved innocent and he would be proved a liar and would be publicly shamed. So this is a blessing in a way, a blessing in disguise. We tend to only look, and the critics especially tend to only look at this being a one-sided test. But the point is, in the culture and time, a woman had little to no defense. If she was suspected of being an adulteress, or her husband just wanted to make up an excuse to get rid of her, it was his word, and that's all that mattered. But in the Bible, there had to be a public ceremony where he does this, and that if she is proven to be innocent, then he's in big trouble. So it would discourage that kind of careless, cold-blooded, callous throwing away of wives, because the wives had no recourse. So if the men of Israel wanted to use this one-sided test to show a husband's authority, it also represented God's authority, reminding them of their own unfaithfulness as a spiritual wife of God. Israel is described as being married to God, and an unfaithful wife at that. And so this test should also remind the men of Israel that they were also an adulterous wife, and God had more than suspicion against them. In any case, society considered women property, and God is simply regulating this practice. The explanation of the actual physical curse that would happen if she was guilty, it seems plausible that this, whatever it was about this, and there's some element of supernatural going on here, because just putting some dust in the water wouldn't cause this. But if she were guilty, her body would be affected in such a way that she could bear no more children. And you can read Constable's notes about that. And he contrasts this situation with one where they know the identity of the man who committed adultery with her, in which case both were to be executed, according to Leviticus 20:10. That is to say, if they caught the couple, then both were to be stoned to death. But if nobody was caught, they didn't know who the man is, couldn't prove it, and the husband was suspicious, then this test would apply. And Constable, if you go and read on in his notes there, also makes a point of the fact that there's no corresponding right of the wife to test an adulterous husband. And again, though God makes concessions and puts limits on human choices, he never intended the practice or attitude of humans ruling over other humans. This is just him regulating it. And we have to remember that the injustices of this life will be compensated for in the next. The first shall be last. People with any kind of entitlement mentality would also do well to remember Jesus' warning in Matthew 7:2 that we will be judged the way we have judged others. So let's not get a big head about having authority, or either feeling that God doesn't value them on the other hand, because injustices in this life will be turned over. The tables will be turned in the next life, and that will last forever. So if a person is enjoying entitlement now for society reasons, or even if they think the Bible gives them these entitlements because of their flesh and no other reason, then they really don't know their Bible too well and have no fear of God. Anyway, let's go on to chapter 9, and this is Constable's notes down in 27. And chapter 9 in Numbers, God makes provisions for those who couldn't celebrate the Passover due to being defiled, or they were out of the country or whatever, that they could celebrate it 1 month later. So again, we see that God is not a hard legalist when there are good reasons for an inability, not just an unwillingness, to follow his decrees. But we should be careful not to use an auxiliary feast to confuse and obfuscate, I can write it, but I can't say it, prophetic symbols. Some people will take these secondary auxiliary celebrations for people whose circumstances wouldn't allow them to celebrate the main one as some kind of prophetic trump card over what most people believe about, such as the when the church was born, when the rapture might happen, and things like that. It seems rather unlikely at best that God would use one of these secondary concessions as having primary prophetic significance. Now let's go down to the next page here in Constable's notes. Because when it comes to prophetic symbols, we can't gloss over these two silver trumpets. I think I have those on, there should be on this page somewhere. Yeah, there we go. These two silver trumpets were to signal Israel first to break camp and then second to move out, and to do so in a controlled and orderly manner. This was not a mad rush for the border. This was going out tribe by tribe at a certain time. So, again, referencing prophecy, these not as yet trumpet judgments of Revelation, they were not revealed. That Revelation was the last book of the Bible given. And so when Paul refers to the last trump in 1 Corinthians 15:52, he was not thinking of that which had not been revealed. He was thinking of these silver trumpets that says break camp and move out. The last one is the move. So the last trump is, as John put it in Revelation, come up here. First verse of chapter 4, I believe. So the trumpet judgments of Revelation have nothing to do with these two silver trumpets, the last of which was move out. So now let's go down to page 30 here in the notes. And we see this nice little chart showing when and where the nation moved from one place to another. So, and then they give the chapter numbers at the bottom there, approximately where these things happened in the three books that we've been studying. We're in Numbers now, but this is their total travels from Egypt, Exodus 13. They were in transit through 19, and then they're stationary, and then we get into because they've entered Sinai, we can see here. So they were in Egypt, they traveled, they went to Sinai, all this time through half of Exodus into Leviticus, and then partly into Numbers, and then they do some traveling more in Numbers than the other books. So what we see here is that the nation is moving, and then on let's see, page 32, we have a map also of where these travels were. And the thing is, though, that just as Israel seems to be getting its act together as they're moving around and making mistakes and being corrected, they find another excuse to whine again and earn God's punishment, and that will start in chapter 11 of Numbers. And according to, let me skip down a couple more pages here in Constable's notes. You can see there's a lot of them, 118 pages, but some people take the complainers of chapter 11 in Numbers as the non-Hebrews who left Egypt with them, because it wasn't all Hebrews. Some of the Egyptians came too, and a lot of commentators take that as the source or beginning of complaints, though certainly the complaints were picked up and amplified by the Hebrews themselves. But it seems to a lot of people that the instigators of these complaints were the non-Hebrews. And this is another lesson we can learn today about seeking what is exciting and flashy and the ever-changing trinkets the world offers. As far as this is what the people wanted, the familiar. They wanted to go back to Egypt where, the food had more variety. And churches do the same thing, though, or churchgoers, I should say. They want experiences. It's a high from one worship service to the next, or one song to the next. And there's nothing wrong with the joy of worshiping God, but if that's the sum and total of somebody's faith, there's a serious problem. And we should not always think that God is only in the exciting songs or the really spiritual feelings or a rousing sermon. That's not what we should look for, because that's exactly the root of the complaint of the Israelites here, is that they had variety and excitement in Egypt, which they're not getting out here in this barren wasteland. So, and of course, we can apply that figuratively to our walk as Christians. Sometimes we have barren wastelands, but that's also sometimes where the biggest lessons are and the most spiritual experiences, if that's what people are seeking. But again, we shouldn't be seeking experiences. We should be seeking the one who gives them. So now let's go down to page 37 in the notes here. And there's been some more housekeeping regarding governing day-to-day whining and so forth. But the discontent reaches the point where even Aaron and Miriam become a problem. They had an issue with Moses marrying a non-Hebrew, though there's some disagreement over whether she was from Cush or Ethiopia, and they assume he married her after his first wife Zipporah had died. At this time, God had only forbidden the Israelites to marry Canaanites, so there was no ethical reason for the complaint. In other words, it was a pretense for saying, we want to be on the same level as you, you're our brother, literally flesh brother and sister to Moses. So they were saying that, they needed a reason to complain, and so they started picking on his second wife and use that as their excuse. But what the text seems to emphasize is not the excuse, but the attitude, and that's the thing, is why they did this. They wanted to be equal, like I said, and Miriam apparently is the main antagonist. Aaron is a yes man. We've already seen that. He'll do whatever the most prominent voice tells him to do at the moment. So in this case, Miriam is the leader, and she is, because of that, stricken with the same instant skin disease. Most people think of leprosy. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. We don't know. But this is the same thing that had happened to Moses when he was doubting God's sanctioning of his leadership. He was saying, I'm not the one. You got to get somebody else. And God said, put your hand into your cloak and pull it out. And it was white with skin disease, leprosy, whatever. And then he put it back and it was healed. Well, this same thing happens to Miriam, only it doesn't go away. And so Aaron, her brother, who helped her do this, pleads with Moses for her healing. He is, as the follower and not the leader, all we can do is speculate that that's why he wasn't stricken. But he prayed, Aaron pleads with Moses, Moses prays to God, and although she is healed, she would have to stay in quarantine or solitary confinement for a week outside the camp. So the thing is, lest we point fingers at Miriam, how many of us would tolerate one of our siblings being chosen by God as our leader? We think, from our vantage point and our high horse, that we can look down on Miriam and go, yeah, Miriam and Aaron, and go, they just wanted power. But remember, Moses was their brother, their little brother, and God had chosen him. And how many of us today can sit on our high horse and go, we wouldn't have done that? Very few, I'm guessing. So now let's go down to page 40 in the notes. And we come to the point where people are to move north. And there's another map here. And they're going to start actually battling with the various people groups of Canaan. And this is where we first read about the men who were sent out to spy out the land so they could decide how best to attack. And one was chosen from each tribe, but the two key names here in these passages are Caleb and Joshua. And Joshua's original name was Hoshea or something like that, and Moses changed it to Joshua, and the meanings you can read about on page 41. He goes into, this paragraph here. So let's move on to page 42 in the notes. And this is the report of the spies, and they come back and they all agree that it's a good land, Canaan, but 10 out of 12, so not Caleb and Joshua, were afraid of the people there. Not only because of their fortified cities, but because of the Anakites, who in verse 33 are equated with the Nephilim. Okay, that's chapter 13, 33. These are a branch of the Nephilim. We remember from our study of Genesis that these were the hybrid offspring. The Nephilim were of fallen angels and humans who had, all of them had superhuman strength, but some of them, not all, but some were giants. So these sons of Anak, these children of Anak, were the giant, at least some of the giants. So 10 of the 12 spies have forgotten that it's always God and not them who wins their battles, and they were afraid of these superhuman giants. And incidentally, this is where I think George Lucas got the name Anakin. Just to tell you that Anakin is not, not a good guy after all. But let's go down to starting in page 43 of Constable's notes. And the people are rebelling again. They're whining. They want to go back to Egypt. And they add to their sin this time by threatening to murder Joshua and Caleb for telling them to trust God to give them victory. On top of that, they decide to look for a new leader to take them back to Egypt. So they're done with Moses, they're done with Joshua, they're done with Caleb. And so again, they bring God to the brink of wiping them out and starting over with Moses, who, again, intercedes for them and reminds God what the Egyptians would say if he does this. But for this wholesale rejection of God and complete lack of faith, the adults would never enter the promised land. So God turns them away until they all die and replaced by their children, as I mentioned at the start of the lesson about what a generation is. That generation, whatever decades range that is of their ages, these were the adults, and it would take 40 years for all of them to die off. So now let's go down to page 51. And you do want to read, everything in between. I'm just skipping to highlights here. So, meanwhile, nobody's sure exactly when, as far as the commentaries go, that some part of the Levitical clan of Korah, that, the major tribes had clans within them, and this was the clan of Korah. They decide to do one more step past whining. They actually muster a small force, an army, to rebel against Moses. So they're not talking now. They're actually arming a group of insurrectionists. And they blame Moses for the failure to enter the promised land in spite of the overwhelming evidence to their own guilt. It was never Moses' fault. He gets the blame all the time. He gets it from both ends. God wants to kill them, and they want to kill him, and it's just a mess. But let's go down to 54, if I can highlight that number and go there. And after this, God, deals with the issue and then decides that Aaron as a priest needs to be reconfirmed, the high priest actually. And so they do this little test where they lay down, each tribal leader lays down their staff on the ground. The staff was a symbol of their leadership, just like a scepter of a king. And God would show them, I think by the next morning, which tribe was chosen to be his priestly tribe. And it says that not only did buds form on Aaron's staff, it also produced almonds. It was some kind of almond branch or something. At least that's what it says in the text. You can check chapter 17 of Numbers. So not only has God once and for all put an end to questions over his choice of leaders, he's also tells them to put Aaron's staff into the ark, or in front of the ark, not sure, as a reminder to go along with the jar of manna and the stone tablets. So that's the contents of the Ark of the Covenant. So you can read more about that on, like I said, it goes here into chapter 17. And then we're going to skip down in the notes here to 61. And for some reason that's still highlighted. I'm not sure why. I was doing a search on Aaron earlier. Don't know why that's highlighted, but anyway. They give, the text gives a lot more details about priestly service in chapters 18 through 19. And it's during that time that they record the death of Miriam. And it's in one of these pages around here somewhere, but you can look for that. And in the text also, I believe it's chapter 19 where her death is recorded. And she's buried there in the wilderness, but right away, the people begin to whine about having no water. I guess because people with the memory of a goldfish need lots of water. Who knows? So God tells Moses to assemble them in front of a rock that he is supposed to speak to and make water come out. But instead of speaking, he strikes it twice with his staff. This works, but because he struck it instead of only speaking, he and Aaron would be denied entry to the promised land as well as the rest of the adults that had died off. So even these two, Moses and Aaron, who were vindicated over and over as God's leaders, were not above accountability for when they failed. And that's another lesson for us all, that and this is repeated by Paul in the New Testament when he gives instructions about elders, and he says, don't lightly entertain accusations against an elder, but require 2 or 3 witnesses. And we'll learn more about that in the next lesson. But the thing about the elders is that you have to make sure that there's a valid case against them. And if they are examined and found guilty, then they are to be publicly reprimanded as a lesson to the other elders. They were not to be given a pass. In fact, the standards are higher, not lower. We tend to make them lower for leaders. We look the other way and excuse them because they do some other great work. But the Bible never supports that in either testament. It says if you're in leadership, the standards are higher. And God, in this case with Moses and Aaron, used them for their full lifespan, but they themselves were denied the greatest blessing of all, which, Moses and Aaron were chosen to lead the people of Israel from Egypt to the promised land, but they themselves were not qualified to go there. So no one should think, even if God is using them in some great way, that they are above reproach, above scrutiny, above the law. They will be held to accountable, maybe in a different way, but they will be held accountable. And we can guess from the scriptures that this penalty will be at least as severe as for anyone else, because they have influence to lead people astray. And that's why I think it's James in the New Testament who said, not many should be teachers because you'll be judged more strictly. So another lesson to be learned, we can always find something to learn, and that's what, and again, the New Testament says that the Old Testament is for, as far as Christians are concerned, is not for our obedience, but for our learning, that these are lessons that we should glean from these events. Now, we're going to stop here for this lesson and pick up the next one in chapter 20.